Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Johnson with the Purchasing Division. Welcome to today's session on doing business with West Virginia, presented by Technical Services Manager Mark Totten and Senior Buyer Crystal Husted. It's scheduled to last until 11:30. We will take a short break in that time. The PowerPoint was emailed yesterday, so you can print that out to follow along or just follow along on the screen. We will be answering questions throughout today's presentation. So when you think of a question, just go ahead and put it in the chat window and send to the host. Let's get started with Mark Totten.
All right, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for being here with us this morning. If at any time we have questions, I'll pay attention to the Q&A box, and Courtney will alert me of a question. Again, as Courtney said, my name is Mark Totten, and in my role as Technical Services Manager with the Purchasing Division, I'm responsible for several programs, including the state's vendor registration program and the state's Small Women and Minority-Owned Business Certification Program. And we're going to talk about both of those programs today in the context of how you, as the vendor audience, can pursue state contract and ordering opportunities with West Virginia state agencies in our 55 counties. So questions that I want you all to be able to ask, by the end of this, we're going to talk about why does the state buy from the private sector in the first place? And we're going to talk about how procurement is set up within state government. And we're going to talk about several different competitive strategies in hopes that one or more of these strategies will fit the business model for your entity. And my hope is that as we talk about these different strategies to compete for state business, that you're able to fill in the blanks with your own company in mind and pick up a strategy that's going to work for you if you decide to go forward with pursuing business with our state. We're also going to talk about how you can find out what the state of West Virginia needs at any given point. And that conversation is going to revolve around a public publication called the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. Obviously you can't compete for state business if you don't know what the state needs. So we'll make sure you're aware of how you can learn what it is the state is trying to buy from the private sector. We're also going to talk about some informational strategies that will help you in your competitive bid journey. We're going to talk about commodity-based alerts, and we're going to talk about some information that's on the Purchasing Division website, wvpurchasing.gov, and we're also going to talk about statewide contract opportunities, and we'll go into detail about what statewide contracts are. We'll also talk about, and this conversation in the chain of events comes after you've pursued state business, but we'll talk about what it takes for your entity to become eligible to receive a state contract, including some details about our vendor registration program, and we'll also talk about how the SWAM certification program can additionally help you compete for state government business nationwide. Now, when I turn things over to Senior Buyer Crystal Husted, she's also going to go into detail about how different state contract types affects the different ways in which you would respond to those competitive solicitations. She'll also go into detail about how state buyers and state procurement officers evaluate your responses to these different types of contracts and some of the problem-solving methods that exist between the state and the vendor community. So let's start going into detail and let's talk about the beginning. Why does state government buy from the private sector in the first place? As some of you may know, the state of West Virginia employs over 25,000 people in 55 counties, and you may think, why does the state even need anything when it has so many resources? And the fact is that sometimes the state of West Virginia, even with these human resources, are not able to manufacture everything we need, or it would not be cost efficient for the state of West Virginia's agencies to manufacture these things that it needs internally. So in these cases, it's more cost effective for the state to solicit competition from the private sector. Now, in addition, because the state has so many agencies spread across our 55 counties, we're able to harness our bulk buying power collectively and obtain very competitive prices for the most commonly needed goods and services that, we consume in a given year. Now, in some cases, another source of major state spend are emergency purchases. Sometimes when life and property is at risk, an emergency purchasing situation is declared, and the state will go to the private sector because that's the source of the most expedient solution for whatever emergency situation exists. For example, a roof collapses, there's flood damage, there's, flooding from an abandoned mine. In some cases, these emergency situations cause the state to go to vendors like you on very short notice, and we'll talk a little bit about making yourself known to state agencies so you might be able to be on hand in these situations. So because it affects how you would interact with the state and how you would compete for state business, I want to talk a little bit about how the state procures certain goods and services so that you're aware of how to formulate your strategy and your approach and where you might need to spend your time competing for state business. And, in large part, how the state buys goods and services from the private sector is determined by a dollar threshold. And the most important dollar threshold for you all to know is the $25,000 threshold. And what's the significance of that? Well, if something the state needs is expected to cost under $25,000, that can actually be handled by the specific state agency under their own purchasing authority. If something is expected to exceed $25,000 in cost, those solicitations are actually going to be administered by my agency, the West Virginia Purchasing Division, on behalf of the specific agency in need. Now, what is the relevance of this to you? Now, not only does this affect where you send your response to the solicitation, but it can also affect who you are in communication with in regard to competing for state business. Now, think about your own entity. Think about, the average cost of your own orders. You may already be thinking, well, most of what I sell is under $25,000, or most of what we sell is over $25,000. This will affect your approach to interacting with West Virginia state government. Now, if you think a large part of your business may be in the under $25,000 world, you can market yourself directly to state agency procurement officers. And there's actually a list of these procurement officers available on our website at that link we've provided in the second column, in the first column. There's also a vendor procurement guide that we published that gives you a little bit of introductory information about how to market yourself to state agencies. And one thing to remember, if you are dealing with state agencies directly in this under $25,000 world, agency to agency, there may be variations in bidding procedures. So the way in which you submit a response to one agency in in the under $25,000 world may be different from how you submit a response to another agency. For example, one agency may accept electronic responses. One agency may insist that you submit your response on paper, or vice versa. Now, in the over $25,000 world, since that's where the purchasing division operates, a lot of the different contract types will be covered by Crystal Husted. Now, the most important thing to remember in addition to whom you will be communicating, is if you're submitting a response in the under $25,000 world, that response goes directly to the agency. If you're submitting a response being administered by the purchasing division for the over $25,000 world, your response is going to go to the purchasing division in Building 15 at the West Virginia State Capitol Complex.
We do have a question. At what dollar amount does the state of West Virginia need a purchase order?
Okay. The question, at what dollar amount does the state of West Virginia need a purchase order? Essentially there's going to be some type of award document for any order of any dollar amount. Now, we have an internal purchasing system called OASIS, and there's a certain dollar threshold at which there's going to need to be a award document created in OASIS, but the state doesn't have such thing as petty cash. So for any order, there's going to be some type of award document. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, and if you have a follow-up to that, please let us know.
We have one more. The $25K threshold includes both the professional services fee and the project cost together, correct? It wouldn't be $25K for a fee and $25K for the project.
It's all together. The $25,000 threshold is for the entirety of the contract, and then within that amount, it could be broken down, a certain amount for services and a certain amount for raw materials or whatever, but that dollar threshold is for the entirety of that transaction. Now, in the under $25,000 world, don't be discouraged by the relatively lower dollar amount. Your business may make more money in quantity of smaller orders than the larger over $25,000 contracts. Now, within the under $25,000 world, especially if you think this is primarily where your transactions with the state would fall, there's certain thresholds that make business within that amount easier, especially for the smaller dollar purchases. Now, and all these dollar thresholds are in regard to whether or not the state agency has to put this out for bid and to what extent you need to document your price response. Now, if a state agency needs something under $2,500, no competition is required for that dollar amount. Now, if you are preparing a transaction with a state agency, or if the cost estimate is between $2,500 and $10,000, all the state agency needs to do in order to solicit bids within the $2,500 to $10,000 amount is to get 3 verbal bids from vendors. So a state agency may just call you, you provide your price verbally, and that would be all you have to do on your part in order to compete. Now, when you get up between the above $10,000 and $25,000, you would have to put your bid in writing in some form or fashion. But in the under $25,000 world, there's a lot of flexibility at the agency level that makes competing from your perspective easier than what the requirements for a solicitation over $25,000 would be. Now, we've set up some of the basics about how the state of West Virginia's agencies procure goods and services from the private sector. So what I'm going to do is introduce 3 different strategies for you to keep in mind regarding how to compete for state government business in West Virginia. Now, these 3 strategies are by far not the only strategies available for you to receive state business and compete for state business, but these are 3 common strategies that I put together for you all to keep in mind and potentially fill in the nature of, how your business operates. So part of the success of this, me explaining these 3 strategies, is going to depend on what you bring to the table with knowledge of your business. So hopefully one or more of these fits for your business model. The first, and what I think is the most important strategy, focuses around the primary way in which you're going to learn what the state of West Virginia needs at any given time. And that involves becoming very familiar with a public publication called the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, which is available to read on a website called wvoasis.gov. And when you go to wvoasis.gov, there's a section of it called the Vendor Self-Service Portal. And within that Vendor Self-Service Portal is where the Purchasing Bulletin lives. And the Purchasing Bulletin is used to advertise at any given time what all of West Virginia's state agencies need and currently have out for public bid. You can view the Purchasing Bulletin as a guest, or you can create an account specific for your company, but there's essentially no obstacle to read the Purchasing Bulletin. There's no costs involved to read it. There's no obstacle for your company, large or small, to not know what is currently out for bid in West Virginia's agencies. And that is what is the great equalizer regarding doing business with West Virginia's government agencies. It's public knowledge what the state needs at any given time. In my view, this is the most important strategy for you all to compete where something that you can provide the state is needed by the state. There may not be, like if you look at the Purchasing Bulletin today, there may not be something specific that your company can provide, but if you keep checking in a week, in a month, in 3 months, whatever it is you are in business to do, there's a chance the state will need it and have it out for public advertisement that at some point if you become a regular reader of the Purchasing Bulletin. Now, I mentioned that you can read the bulletin as a guest, or you can create an account on behalf of your company. And if you take that latter route and create that account, you will be assigned a vendor number in our WV Oasis system. And that Oasis number is what your business entity would be identified as in our procurement system, as you compete for state business online and then potentially receive an award document in the Oasis system. Now, one thing I'll note about the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin is that state agencies are only required to put something in the bulletin that exceeds $10,000 in cost. But sometimes, especially when a state agency has something obscure they need, even at a low dollar amount, they can put it in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin no matter what the anticipated cost, especially if they want to have it advertised for competition. Now, if you're already thinking everything that we sell or provide would be under $10,000, that's when those thresholds from a few slides ago would be most important. And we'll talk in the next strategy about how you can make yourself known by state agencies if you want to, receive those verbal bid requests or those written bid requests in the under $10,000 world. Now, one thing I'll note, we've talked about our vendor registration program that is required before you would receive a state contract. You actually don't have to go through that registration process in order to respond to a solicitation. You only have to register with the purchasing division if you are the apparent successful vendor for a state order or a state contract. So when it comes to you providing quotations to the state of West Virginia's agencies, there's not a prerequisite regarding registration that you have to meet just to bid. So, and it would not be in the state's advantage if we required a lot of prerequisites for you to just provide a cost for a project that's being advertised. The state wants to encourage as much competition as possible because for us that means we're going to get more competitive pricing from the vendor community for whatever specific solicitation is advertised.
Someone just wants to confirm that it's the total cost of the bid that determines the threshold.
Okay, the total, whether or not it's the total cost of the bid to determine what threshold a solicitation would fall in, it is the entirety of the transaction. Whatever the total cost of the project is going to be, that is what determines the dollar threshold it would fall under procedurally. So no matter how the project is broken up by line item, the state is going to put that in a dollar threshold based on the entirety of the project, the transaction cost.
So he's following up, okay. Yeah, he had a follow-up, but then he says very clear. If he sells $1,000 items but always has 11 or more of them, he would always be above the 10,000 threshold.
Let me ask you a follow-up. Are you talking about multiple transactions, or are you talking about one transaction? Because there is a way to,
single transaction.
If we're talking about one single transaction with the state, it's the entirety of the transaction that's going to be what the state views as the total cost. And I wanted to clarify that because, just as an example, you couldn't say, and I'm just going to, this is purely, I don't know what it is you're in business to do, so this is completely hypothetical. You couldn't sell 20 feet of fence to the state. If the state needs 1,000 feet of fence, you couldn't sell it 20 feet at a time to make it smaller dollar transactions. We're looking at the cost of the entire fence. Something like that couldn't be broken up. That's why I wanted you to clarify if you were talking about one transaction or multiple transactions over the course of, say, a year. And if you have any follow-ups to that, please let me know. Now, we're still talking about the first competitive strategy for you to keep in mind as you approach the state's bid process. And, as we mentioned, this first strategy revolves around becoming very familiar with the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin and what information is contained within. And I wanted to show you just a glimpse of what the Purchasing Bulletin looks like at any given time. You can see that we have, in this example, 5 different projects listed. I just took a screen capture from the bulletin, and so I can highlight it here for you. You see on the left column that you have a very brief description of each particular project that's out for bid. Now, if you wanted to learn more about each particular project, you could click on that button that says Details and get more information, and I'll go into detail about that. But becoming familiar with the Purchasing Bulletin essentially just involves you glancing through what the state has out for bid and seeing if any of these project descriptions match what it is you're in business to provide. Now, on the right column, you can see there's a timer, and each particular solicitation is out for bid for a specific amount of time, and your potential response to these advertisements would have to be completed before the timer runs out, essentially. Now, in the middle column, you can see what agency has this particular project out for bid, who the procurement officer responsible for that is. And I also want to point something else out that relates to the $25,000 threshold. In the left column, and hopefully it's big enough to see on your screen, in the left column, every project number has a prefix. And the prefix is 4 letters. For example, CRFQ, ARFQ, CRFP, ARFP, etc. The first letter in that 4-letter prefix is either going to be an A or a C. The A designates that as an agency delegated project, which is going to fall in the under $25,000 threshold. If one of these solicitation prefixes starts with a C, that indicates that it is going through the central purchasing process at the purchasing division and is expected to exceed $25,000. So at a glance, you can see on this very first screen in the bulletin how much the state estimates a project is going to cost, over or under $25,000. Now, let me go back to the bulletin here. In the top middle of the purchasing bulletin, you see a box that's labeled keyword search. And let's say you don't want to go through every single thing the state has out for bid at a given time, which is very likely because you're not in business to read the purchasing bulletin every day. You can search by keyword if you have certain criteria that you want to search related to your business. And I want to give you some tips on how to search that by keyword, because the purchasing bulletin keyword search is not as instinctive as what we're used to with, say, Google.com. So you want to keep your keyword search of the purchasing bulletin as simple as possible. And you see in my examples, I've put in building maintenance and phone system as very simplified examples of what your search criteria should be. The reason for this is if you make your search criteria really long and any of those words are not in the project description that the state has put in these in the advertisement, you're going to eliminate a potential match from your search that may be relevant to you. Now, also, you'll see that I have put what we're going to call wildcards around my keyword search terms. You see that I have, in the word building maintenance, I've put asterisks around every single word. Same with phone system. I've put asterisks all around phone system in my keyword search, and I'll tell you why. And it's the same. I'm trying to keep you all from falling into the same problem that I mentioned. If you make your keyword search too long, you could eliminate a match if you throw a word in there that's not actually there. Now, with phone system, for example, let's say you type in phone system without an asterisk, and there's actually something out for bid that's labeled phone and fax system. You know, by putting that asterisk in the middle of phone and system, you actually keep the possibility of a match in play if that description actually has additional words in there, such as phone and fax system. So hopefully this slide explains it a little bit better than I am. And it's a little bit tricky to get used to searching the bulletin, especially since other internet searches are so instinctive now. But what I'm trying to do in this first strategy is lay out every possible opportunity for you to find out what the state needs without eliminating any potentially relevant matches for your company.
We do have a question. Is there a way to receive the bids by email weekly or daily versus using OASIS?
Okay, the question, is it possible to receive alerts by email? And there is. And we're actually going to talk about that in regard to commodity code-based email alerts. And I'm actually going to save that answer because I have a couple slides that are going to illustrate that answer for me. So if you can bear with me and wait on that answer, I'll go into better detail when I've got a slide to illustrate that. Now, I mentioned that on wvoasis.gov, in this vendor self-service portal, you have the option to create an account for yourself on behalf of whatever company you represent. And I want to tell you there are some advantages to taking the time to set up a login ID for yourself in our vendor self-service portal. One of the advantages is setting up those commodity code-based email alerts that you're asking about that I'm going to go into more detail regarding. Having a login ID also gives your company the option to respond to an advertisement online on behalf of your company. You know, obviously you couldn't log in as a guest and give us a price because we'd have no idea who it came from. And when you set up this account for your company, you've got the option to enter and save information about your company, such as different ordering addresses. That's going to make it convenient for you, especially if you're going to do business with the state a lot. You don't have to type in a lot of the basic information each time. Now, one advantage to this portal is you can set up user IDs for multiple employees at your company. It doesn't just have to be one person that has the power to log into West Virginia's vendor self-service portal. And you can also control access differently for, multiple employees. Now, the vendor self-service portal also gives you the option to register with the purchasing division online. Again, this would not be required to bid, but when you start receiving orders from the state of West Virginia, you would need to be registered with the purchasing division. And that registration involves two things. One is a disclosure of information about your business entity, as well as the payment of a $125 annual fee, depending on the amount of business you're receiving from the state's agencies statewide.
We have a question. Can I get commodity alerts for commodities that I don't specifically provide?
Okay. The question, can you get commodity alerts for things that you don't provide? The way the commodity code-based email alerts is going to be set up is you're going to get alerts on commodities that you sign up for. So I'll show you the section of the vendor self-service portal where you would potentially enter commodities that are specific to your business. You can essentially enter whatever commodity code you want to have saved in your registration record in the vendor self-service portal, but you're not going to get commodity code alerts unless you put in some related commodity code in your record. Now, going back to some of the advantages of setting up a vendor self-service account, and going through and then later, if you go through the various registration processes with state agencies, I wanted to note that the finance division will require that you have a W-9 on file before you would receive payment upon completion of a project. And even though we don't have anything to do with the finance division's requirements, I wanted to mention, since I'm talking about purchasing's registration requirements, that if you don't have a W-9 on file with the finance division, they're going to need one at some point. And you can email a signed W-9 to the Finance Division at the email address that I've provided on that last bullet point, just to give you a little bit of information about the ordering registration as well as the payment registration for your business entity. Okay, I've got a question showing up on mine that what is the difference between the Vendor Self-Service Portal and the Purchasing Division's VRP? Why would I have to pay the $125 annual fee to submit a proposal in response to an RFP? And I wanted to note that you don't actually have to register with the Purchasing Division and pay the annual fee in order to provide a response to any contract type. So if you're responding to an RFP, you can do so even if you're not registered with the Purchasing Division. So again, the state wants to encourage as much competition as possible for any contract type that we have out for bid. So you can respond to, honestly, any number of solicitations out there, and until you're the apparent successful vendor for a specific project, you wouldn't have to register with Purchasing Division and pay that $125 annual fee. And if that doesn't answer your question, please let me know. Now, I wanted to show you a couple examples that show approximations of what you have at your disposal if you decide to set up your own user ID on behalf of your company in the Vendor Self-Service Portal. Now, on the left screenshot shows approximately what the main screen in Vendor Self-Service looks like, and that just shows some basic information about your company, your vendor number, your tax ID, the legal name that we have on file for you, and then you see at the top you have different tabs available that show things like the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin under the Business Opportunities tab. And you'll see on the left screenshot there's a tab for users. And under users, that's where the administrator of your account can add additional employees if you want several people at your company to have access to your business entity's record in Vendor Self-Service. Now, going back to the question about commodity code-based email alerts, I want you all to know about the email alert system as part of this first strategy, because what this comes down to is you are making yourself aware of what the state of West Virginia needs. And at the foundation of all of this is knowing what the state's trying to buy, right? So the first thing I've talked about, reading the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, that's one hand that's dipping into the Purchasing Bulletin on your behalf to make you aware of what's out there. Now, a second hand to work for you are these email alerts. And if you look at my screenshot on the right, you'll see I'm in a section called Commodities. And that's where you can add in your entity's specific vendor record in OASIS what commodities you can potentially provide to the state of West Virginia's agencies. And let me back up for a minute. What is a commodity code? A commodity code is a global classification system that's used to classify anything on the earth that can be manufactured and sold. So for whatever it is you're in business to do, there's probably a commodity code number that classifies that. And what I would compare it to, and hopefully everybody in this audience knows what I'm talking about, the old Dewey Decimal System in your school library, that's what I would compare commodity code classifications to. So just like the Dewey Decimal System classified genres of books into different categories, the commodity code library that we use actually has hundreds of thousands of different commodity codes that classify everything from steel to gravel to IT consulting services, anything you can possibly imagine. And I'll come back to how you can find your specific commodity codes that are relevant to your business. But I want to show you one more thing from the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, and that is what I alluded to earlier when I talked about a button you can click on each advertisement that shows you more detail about what the state needs in a specific project. And if you see something in that initial list of projects that you think might be relevant to your business, you can click on details and this is what you see. You'll see a longer description of whatever it is that's being advertised, and you'll also see several file attachments that are going to have all the nitty-gritty about this project included. And that can include anything from architectural drawings to part numbers to a pricing sheet that you can fill out and complete for, any number of widgets that the state agency may be trying to buy and wants a price for each one. You'll also see that there's a button where you can respond online, and that would start the process of you preparing your electronic solicitation. But keep in mind, you may very easily be able to provide a paper response to this same advertisement if the agency allows, and your paper response would be evaluated with the same weight as an online response. So those options will very likely be available to you, and I would just recommend you go with wherever your comfort level is, whether or not you decide to respond on paper or electronically. Now, on this detail screen, you'll also see the same timer that tells you how long you have to respond to this particular solicitation. But what I would stress more than anything is that you download and read every single file attachment, because not only is there going to be specific information about what the state needs, measurements, specifications, every single way that you can possibly describe the product, but there's also terms and conditions that you would be entering into if you are the successful vendor for this particular need. Now, what this screen illustrates is what it looks like if you have clicked the Respond Online button and started the process of preparing an electronic response to this advertisement. And you'll see that there's a 5-step process for you to provide your prices, upload anything like a pricing sheet that you may need to fill out, or upload anything else that you want the state to have to evaluate your response to this solicitation. And I'm not going to go through all 5 steps, but I wanted you to see approximately what to expect if you decide to prepare your solicitation response electronically. Now let's go into the detail I promised about the commodity code-based email notifications. The commodity code library that the state of West Virginia uses is from the United Nations. And when you are trying to find the commodity codes that are relevant to your business, one way you can do this is going out to the United Nations Products and Services website, which is on this slide as unspsc.org. And you can see I've got a screenshot of that website illustrated, and you can enter a keyword description of whatever it is you do, whether it's roofing, steel, nursing services, providing aggregate, whatever. You can keyword search your particular business model, and the unspsc.org website will give you probably multiple commodity codes that potentially describe what it is you do. And what you would do with the commodity codes is go back to vendor self-service, to this screen on the right in your vendor profile where you can click the Commodities tab and press the button there that says Add Items and put in and save every one of these commodity codes in your vendor record. And it's advantageous to you to put in multiple commodity codes. You don't have to pick just one. You can pick multiple codes that describe one or more aspects of your business model. And that is going to lay the groundwork for you to get emails whenever the state puts something out for bid based on that particular commodity. Now, in order for there to be a match, there has to be, well, let me back up. When a state procurement officer puts something in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, behind the scenes, they actually classify that advertisement with a commodity code. And if the commodity code in the project going out for bid matches something that's already in your vendor profile, then that should trigger the email that says something to the effect of such and such agency has put something out for bid. You have indicated that you can provide that certain commodity. You may want to go to the bulletin and look at it. You know, this is the other hand working for you in this first strategy to find out what is put in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin. So checking it yourself is one hand working for you, and setting up these email alerts is another hand looking for you. So that gives you a two-handed approach to finding out what is in the bulletin. And that's why I think this is the most important strategy, because this is the greatest source of information to you. Now, when you get this information, whether or not you decide to prepare a response is up to you, but you don't have the freedom to make that decision if you're not aware of what the state needs. And that is why the first strategy is so important and why I'm trying to give you a two-handed approach to go about it. Now, I would never tell you to rely on only one hand or the other hand to search the bulletin. You know, it's best to use those two search methods together. But I just want you to walk away from here knowing every possible opportunity to see what it is the state of West Virginia needs, so you can see and make the decision if you can provide that.
We have a question. What if you offer services like software development and staffing?
Okay, is that the question? What if you offer something like software development and staffing? You know, if you mean that question in the context of what commodity codes to use, there are information technology-based commodity codes in the United Nations library that cover things like consulting services, information systems consulting, IT staffing. So, you know, some of the examples I gave, like for gravel and roofing, you know, I tend to, you know, my hometown background kind of bends me toward providing more tangible examples of stuff you can see and feel, but the United Nations Commodity Code Library actually encompasses, you know, any good or service that can be provided globally. And hopefully, if that's not the context in which you were asking that question, please let me know and I'll give you a more appropriate answer. Okay, so the second strategy that I want to put out there for you all to consider is primarily for the vendors on this call that saw the $25,000 threshold slide and said to yourself, we'll never sell anything to the state that's over $25,000. You know, this potential strategy is for you. And go back to when we were talking about verbal bids, written bids in that under $25,000 world. In order for a state agency to call or email or fax you a verbal or a written bid request in the under $25,000 world, they need to know that you're out there, where you are, and what it is you're in business to provide. So the second strategy that I want to put out there is marketing yourself to specific state agencies' procurement officers. And I mentioned that there's a list of procurement officers for over 100 state agencies on our website. And I put the link on this slide, again, for you to have so you can look at all the different state agencies for which we have contact persons listed. Now, when you think about what it is you're in business to do, you may already think about 3, 4, or 5 state agencies that would particularly need your goods and services. You know, there's hundreds of state agencies out there, and not every single one of them is going to likely need what it is you provide. So looking at our state agency procurement officer listing may give you 3, 4, or 5 different agencies that you want to target with an introduction. And I've had a lot of vendors put together a one-page summary about what it is they are in business to do and where they are in West Virginia or wherever else in the world, and send to the procurement officers at those 4 or 5 agencies. And what the hopes of that is that the next time that procurement officer needs something for their agency that you can provide, they remember that introduction they received from you and say, okay, I'm going to call this vendor for a verbal quote, or I'm going to send a written quote, a written request for a quote to this company. You know, remember, in the under $25,000 worlds, state agency procurement officers have the authority to make those purchases on their own without having to go through the purchasing division's formal solicitation process. So you may never work with the purchasing division if the under $25,000 world is where you see your interactions with West Virginia state government. So those procurement officers for those targeted agencies that are listed on our website are going to be a very surgical way for you to compete for state business in the areas of business in which you operate. Now, if you want to go to the extent to research and do your homework, there's some information that we provide in the transparency section of the Purchasing Division website that may help you in knowing what has the state bought in the past. Now, on the transparency section of our website, there's 3 things that I want to point out. Now, of course, the first thing, what is the state seeking, that's covered in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin, which we've covered. Now, one thing you may not be aware of is that on the Purchasing Division website, under bids received, we post responses to solicitations going back years. So you're actually able to see not only what the state is seeking now in the Purchasing Bulletin, but you can look and see what bids have been opened by the Purchasing Division to get a sense of what the state buys, how frequently, and what the competition is like. So you can actually look and see where we have scanned vendor responses after they opened and posted them publicly on the bids received site under transparency and get a sense of who you would be potentially competing against. And of course, you know, that's advantageous when you're trying to decide what price do I want to list for a particular advertised solicitation. Now, the third thing I want to point out on the transparency page is a report that shows, you know, who was the eventual successful vendor. And that's covered in the Notice of Award report, which we have posted. And the Notice of Award report, week by week, that gives a list of what contracts have been awarded by the Purchasing Division. So if you really want to do your homework when you're preparing your strategy for how to compete for state business, the transparency site, the transparency section shows what the state has needed, what offers were made by other vendors, and who was eventually successful. So marketing yourself to agency procurement officers is the second strategy. And the third strategy is something I alluded to, and that's statewide contract opportunities. Now, what is a statewide contract? What we call a statewide is an agreement for the most frequently purchased commodities or services that all of West Virginia's agencies in the 55 counties need. So we're talking about commonly purchased goods and services like paper, computers, fuel, things of that nature. That is where the state harnesses its bulk buying power to solicit the most competitive response. And then the statewide agreement that ensues is what all agencies in the state of West Virginia are required to order from. So if you are a vendor in receipt of a statewide contract, you are essentially the exclusive provider of these commonly purchased items for the course of that contract, whether it be a year, 2 years, whatever. Now, the list of, last time I counted, there were about 80 statewide contract agreements that are active in the state of West Virginia. And you can go to the link on this slide if you want to see the active statewide contract list at any given time. Now, if what it is you provide is something that we have a statewide agreement for, we can't add you to that contract today. Statewide contract opportunities are a longer term but potentially higher yield pursuit. But if you research the statewide contracts that are active on our website right now, you'll see when they expire. And when a statewide contract expires, that means that prior to the expiration, they're probably going to go back out for bid. So if you look at a statewide agreement for, let's say, fuel, you'll see that the fuel contract may be in place until December. That gives you a few months to do your homework and formulate your strategy for if that fuel contract is going to go back out for competitive bid, what you would need to do in order to be able to compete successfully to be the state's exclusive fuel provider for the next statewide contract that's issued for that commodity. Again, somebody who is a new vendor on this call is not going to have a statewide contract agreement tomorrow. This is a longer-term pursuit, but think about the opportunity for your business if you become the provider that all agencies in the 55 counties have to go to for the particular commodity or service that's in the catalog agreement for that contract. So those are the three strategies that I wanted to lay out there, and they are by far not the only ways that you would receive state business, but hopefully there was something in those strategies that would fit your business model. And I want to take a moment to talk about what you would need to do if you're the successful vendor for an order or a contract. And I'm going to go into detail about the Purchasing Division's vendor registration requirements. And I mentioned before, they require two things: a disclosure of information about your company, and in some cases, the payment of a $125 annual fee. And again, this would not be relevant when you're bidding. This would be relevant after you have become the apparent successful vendor for a state contract. And the requirements and the reason for the vendor registration requirements are in legislation under West Virginia Code Section 5A312. And the things that we need in the vendor registration process, the disclosure of information that I mentioned includes the legal name of your business, your business's physical address, telephone number, at least 2 owners or officers associated with your business entity, and the city and state in which the owners or officers live, and the name of your business entity's financial institution. Nothing about your EFT or an account number, but just the name of the financial institution where you keep your corporate assets. Now, our vendor registration office at the Purchasing Division can be your central point of contact for learning more about how to do business with the state of West Virginia. You know, in addition to what we've covered in this presentation today, we're happy to communicate with you specifically about your company and send you information by email or U.S. mail or whatever you need from us in order for us to provide information to you that's specific about your business and how you would potentially compete for state opportunities. During the pandemic, if you want to talk to us in person, we would prepare that be by phone or video teleconference, which we can set up. In normal times, you know, it would be completely welcomed for you to make an appointment and sit down with us in Building 15 on the Capitol Complex. But again, right now our building is restricted to 1 visitor at a time, so phone, email, video conference is going to be the best ways for us to have those one-on-one conversations about what it is you're in business to do specifically and how your business model would fit best into competing for state opportunities. Now, I mentioned a second program that we manage, which is the Small Women and Minority-Owned Business Certification Program for the state of West Virginia. And this is actually a 2-year certification that you can apply for free that was created in 2012 with the introduction of West Virginia Code 58359. And businesses that are eligible to become SWAM certified would fall into certain categories like woman-owned status, minority-owned status, veteran-owned status, or small businesses with under 200 employees. Now, what is the advantage of becoming a SWAM certified business with the state of West Virginia? If you are, let's say that you've listened to everything I have said and you have no interest in it. You just don't want to have anything to do with what I've described. But maybe you are competing for business in another state, like the Commonwealth of Virginia, or maybe with a federal entity. If you are competing somewhere else, whether it's with a federal entity or another state, and they will reciprocate a vendor preference for West Virginia's SWAM certification, then that could give you an edge when you go to compete in that other state or with that federal entity. And we even had a West Virginia vendor get SWAM certified so they can bid on an excavation project with the water company. So really, any entity other than the state of West Virginia that you are competing with, if they will reciprocate West Virginia's SWAM certification, then that is something that is advantageous to you to apply for if you qualify, and take that when you compete with other entities. And I would be thrilled to death if a West Virginia company came to us and said, I got SWAM certified, I went to another state and I brought home a contract from that state. That would be a wonderful success story for both of us. So if you could completely disregard everything I've said about doing business with the state of West Virginia, but there's still something here for you with that SWAM certification if you are competing elsewhere. We're happy to provide whatever documentation you would need in those other states to verify that you are West Virginia SWAM certified if it would be advantageous for you. So we're happy to write a letter or whatever it is you would need to go in that bid package. Now at this time, we're going to take a break before I turn it over to Crystal Husted.
We'll take we're running behind, so let's take a very brief break, just a couple of minutes. and then we'll get started with with Crystal's section.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Crystal Husted, and my portion is going to be discussing the purchasing process. We're going to start off with the types of solicitations that are advertised in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin that Mark discussed earlier. We're going to start off with the request for quotations, and you'll see in the vendor self-service or the purchasing bulletin, it's going to be either a CRFQ or an ARFQ. And the difference in that is if it's a C, it's going to be advertised by the West Virginia Purchasing Division, which means that that purchase is estimated to be over $25,000. If it is an ARFQ, that is being advertised by a state agency. So that means that that solicitation is estimated to be under $25,000. Now, when you're looking at an ARFQ, which is the agency request for quotation, like I said, that is solicited by state agencies. The responses will be sent to the agency electronically through VSS, which is the vendor self-service. They may also have other methods for you to submit your response to them, and that's when you need to look through the solicitation documents to find out information of alternate ways that they want you to submit your bid. For a CRFQ, which is a central request for quotation, that is solicited through the West Virginia Purchasing Division. And like I said, that is for purchases that is estimated to be over $25,000. Now, when you're responding to a solicitation that is a CRFQ, you have several different methods to how you can submit your bid. You can submit it through WVOASIS's vendor self-service portal. We also accept fax bids at 304-558-3970, and I want you to note that that is an actual fax machine, so it is not set up to send an e-fax. So when you fax your bid, you actually have to use a fax machine. You can also mail in your response, drop it off in person. Now, the Purchasing Division does not accept email responses at any time. You know, even if you get to 125 and you're having errors in OASIS, I still cannot accept your email response. It is in our instructions to vendors that we post with our solicitations. If it's an ARFQ, the state agency, they have different purchasing procedures, so they may accept an email response, but the West Virginia Purchasing Division does not accept email bids. Mark actually went through the vendor self-service and the purchasing bulletin. When something goes out to bid, you will need to go into wvoasis.gov and download the solicitation documents. We do not mail out solicitations. We actually stopped doing that practice several years ago, so because all of that information is in OASIS. If you go into OASIS and you experience an error when you're trying to download your documents, you will need to call the OASIS help desk, and we actually have that information, their contact information at the end of this slide. Now, when you go into a solicitation, there's going to be multiple attachments, so you want to make sure that you download each attachment, and it's going to include the instructions to vendors submitting bids, terms and conditions. It'll have specifications attached. If there's a pricing page, we'll have an Excel pricing page included in there, or any other drawings or construction documents. I cannot stress enough, please read the instructions to vendors submitting bids. That's where you're going to find important dates such as the bid opening date, the technical question deadline, who to submit your questions to, so it'll have the buyer's email address in there. It'll also have how to submit your responses. But I did say, if you have a technical question regarding the specifications or the solicitation, when it is a solicitation that is advertised by the purchasing division, all questions must be submitted in writing. If you contact me as the buyer and ask me about specifications over the phone, I'm not going to be able to respond to you because those questions need to be coming through as through email. Now, once a requisition has been submitted to the purchasing division, by West Virginia Code of State Rules, that is when the blackout period between agencies and vendors begins. So if you see, if you've worked with, let's say, Division of Highways, if you have contracts with them, and you get a notification about a solicitation, you cannot contact Division of Highways and ask them about the solicitation because they actually cannot respond. They cannot have any contact with you by state law. Now, if you are if you are going to bid on something, but you already have a contract with them and you want to contact them about the contract that you already have, that's fine, but you cannot discuss, or they cannot discuss with you about the current solicitation that is out. Other types of solicitations that are advertised in the West Virginia Purchasing Bulletin is what we call the best value procurements, and that's going to be your request for proposal is one of those. That is two parts. You have a technical portion and you have a cost portion. Now, we do not accept requests for proposals through OASIS because we cannot, the cost has to be filled. So when you submit that response, if you try to submit that response, we don't have a way to prevent the cost from being exposed. So that's why the purchasing division does not accept requests for proposals through OASIS. The other best value procurement is the expression of interest, and those are for architectural and engineering services, and those are based on qualifications and experience, and it's awarded to the highest ranked vendor. There's two types of EOIs. There's the agency expression of interest, which is advertised by a state agency, and a central expression of interest, which is advertised by the West Virginia Purchasing Division. And responses to EOIs can be mailed to the Purchasing Division. We can also accept them by fax, drop off in person, and through WVOASIS. Once again, we can't accept email responses. We also have what we call a request for information, and this is used if an agency is trying to do their market research and they're looking to vendors to help them get ideas of how to write the specification. Now, when we do a request for information, there's no award from it. We are just basically looking for, data sheets or, it's market research on the agency's behalf. Bid submissions. Carefully review your bid before you submit it. Make sure that you have all the documents that are required when you're submitting your bid. If anything that needs a notary seal or signed, you want to make sure that you upload those or provide those with your bid. There also is a requirement now on all contracts awarded in the state of West Virginia that they must include commercial general liability insurance. And if you look at Section 8 of the terms and conditions, that will show you what amounts that the insurance needs to be in, and also if there's any other insurance requirements. If the solicitation requires a bid bond, that bid bond must be received with the bid. We cannot accept a bid bond after the bids have been opened. So you want to make sure if it requires a bid bond that you submit that with your bid. Vendor preference forms are also to be submitted with a bid. And if you look through the instructions to vendors submitting bids, Section 15 through 16, that will give you information on when the preference, what commodities the preference applies to, and we'll also provide you with the link to download the form. Like I stated earlier about any documents that require a notary seal, those documents should be submitted with your bid, and that's the purchasing affidavit. If there was any addendums that were submitted, you would need to provide an addendum acknowledgement form. We would need that prior to award. It's not required with your bid. It just helps us speed up the process. Also, the disclosure of interested parties to contracts, and that's for any contract that is estimated to be over $1 million. And that is, say, if we have an open-end contract for 4 years, it is the cumulative amount of those 4 years. Any licenses, certifications, the drug-free workplace affidavit, will also need that prior to award, but it also helps us if you go ahead and submit that with your bid and if a subcontractor list. All of these forms, it's good to submit with your bid because, like I said, it helps us speed up the process of getting a contract awarded. And this is a screenshot of if you're submitting your response to WVO ACES. You could upload each item as a single attachment, or you could upload it as one scan. It's whatever is easiest for you or your preference. Bids must be received by the date and time listed on in the solicitation documents, and you can find that information in the instructions to vendors submitting bids. We cannot accept a bid after, for us here at the Purchasing Division, our bid openings always occur at 1:30. I cannot accept a bid at 1:31. After that time, anything received after that 1:30 date or 1:30 time is disqualified. Like, there is no exception. We cannot submit. We cannot accept a late bid, and that is actually by West Virginia Code of State Rules, and we've actually listed the code right there. Now, bid opening procedures, it varies for agency to agency. If it has like I said, state agencies have developed their own processes and procedures for bid opening. For a C, it will always be opened by the Purchasing Division. And just to reiterate how the Purchasing Division accepts responses, we accept them through vendor self-service, fax, paper bids by mail, or drop-off. And like I said earlier, we do not accept email bids. Now, if you are faxing your bid, you will not want to wait until right before the bid opening, because that fax machine starts to get very bogged down from everyone trying to submit their bids. And we can't accept, if that last page isn't received by 1:30, it is considered a late bid and disqualified. Our bid openings are open to the public, and since due to the coronavirus, we have actually made our bid openings available virtually, and if you want to watch the Purchasing Division's bid opening, you can just follow that link that's provided. After the bid opening, all bids are posted usually within 24 hours of the bid opening on the West Virginia Purchasing Division's website, and we've also provided that link as well. Now, once the bids is opened, that's when the agency will begin their evaluation. If it is once they've evaluated, they will send a recommendation to award to the buyer, and that's when I will start my evaluation. I'll go through and make sure, what documents that are needed, or if, the agency might have missed something. So I'll do another evaluation before I award. I have vendors quite often emailing me, asking me what a timeline, what's the timeline for award, and we actually don't have a timeline because it is based on when the agency completes their evaluation, and that's totally dependent on their workload, their priorities. So we don't, as the buyers here at the Purchasing Division, we don't have a timeline of when something will be awarded. Now, prior to award, we will need to make sure that a vendor is registered with the West Virginia Secretary of State's office, the Tax Department, and the West Virginia Insurance Commission. Once a contract is awarded, if it is a CRFQ, a CRFP, or a CEOI, which is awarded by the West Virginia Purchasing Division, if you are unsuccessful, you will receive either a faxed or a mailed unsuccessful vendor letter. If you are the successful vendor, you'll be notified by receiving the contract or purchase order. Now, prior to receiving a purchase order, you cannot begin any work or commodity or deliver any commodity. So once you've received your encumbered contract, that is when the blackout period is no longer enforced, and you can contact the agency, the state agency. Now, if you've received the unsuccessful vendor letter, you have, that's when your protest period begins. So as soon as that letter is faxed or mailed, the date that's stamped on that letter, that's when your protest of award time period begins. And you actually have 5 days after that award date to protest the award. We also have a protest of specifications, and that must be submitted in writing 5 days prior to the bid opening. Change orders. A change order is issued to a contract. It could be for a renewal. It can be for an extension, an increase. So those are some types of change orders that might occur for a purchase order or a contract. I'm sorry if I'm going through this very fast. We're closing in we have 5 minutes, so I'm trying to cover everything as detailed as I can. Now, if it's an AMA or APO, that will be a change order issued by a state agency on their own contract. If it's a CMA or a CPO, that will be a contract that was awarded by the Purchasing Division, and the Purchasing Division will issue that change order. Just to go over a couple of things that, some key important information. Like I stated earlier, the Purchasing Division cannot accept late bids. If it's after the 1:30, everything has to be received prior to that 1:30 deadline on the date the bid opens. Anything received after that is considered a late bid and cannot be considered for an award. Formal acquisitions, when we say formal acquisitions, we mean the solicitations by the West Virginia Purchasing Division. You can't communicate with state agencies due to the blackout period, so any questions or communication needs to be submitted through the buyer who is listed on those solicitation documents. Once again, we encourage you to submit all your documents with your bid to help speed up the award process. Some of those documents would be the purchasing affidavit, insurance, addendum acknowledgement forms. That just helps us get the contract awarded quicker. You'll also, in your solicitation documents, you'll want to review the master terms and conditions, and it could be the general terms and conditions, which is the West Virginia Purchasing Division. Anything that's solicited by the Purchasing Division will have master terms and conditions, or general terms and conditions. If it is an agency delegated purchase, it'll have the agency master terms and conditions. So you'll always want to review the solicitation for those terms and conditions. Vendor performance, if you have any delays in your delivery process or if there's some type of performance issue, you always want to make sure that you communicate with the state agency and let them know. If there is a continuous issue with performance, the state agency will contact the West Virginia Purchasing Division, and that's when we will try to help resolve any issues. And this is a list of references. We have the Doings of Business with the West Virginia Purchasing Division, the Vendor Procurement Guide. We have the Vendor Resource Center at the Purchasing Division, on the Purchasing Division's website. We also have an OASIS procurement section, the links for the transparency section on the West Virginia Purchasing Division's website. And I discussed earlier about if you experience any issues when you are in WV OASIS, such as errors in downloading documents, or if you have an error when you're trying to submit your bid, this is actually the contact information for the OASIS help desk. And this is actually the link to the Doing Business with the State of West Virginia Vendor Procurement Guide.
Okay, this is Mark Totten again. Just to mention briefly, we work when needed with the U.S. Small Business Administration in regard to opportunities for SWAM certified vendors. We wanted to put this information out there for you because they could also serve as a resource for you in addition to us, as well as the other organizations that are listed here. Now, I won't repeat what's on this slide because you have a copy, but this is just a recap of the 3 strategies that may fit your business model, and also some of the tools that you can use for competing with the state of West Virginia for business. And then the contact information for myself and our vendor registration coordinator at the Purchasing Division, Tara Oliver, is listed on this slide. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email us. And with that, I will hand it back over to Courtney.
Okay, we didn't have time to get to a lot of the questions, and some of them were about very specific solicitations or issues. So I've collected all the questions that we didn't get to answer, and someone will contact you, either Mark or Crystal, either sometime today or tomorrow. So with that, we'll stay on the webinar if anyone wants to submit any more questions so that we can contact you later. We will stay on for another minute or so for that purpose. But if not, we appreciate you taking some time to spend with us in the webinar today, and hope you have a great rest of the day.